Welcome to this lecture on democracy, concept and significance as part of the e-course on democracy and electoral management. As part of this lecture, we follow a format where first we introduce you to democracy, the concept and its practical manifestations. We then talk about various forms of democracy as they are prevalent in a country like India. We then move on to India as a democracy. What are some of our unique features, the kind of processes Indian democracy has been through, and in terms of its inherent characteristics that our democracy brings in. And finally, moving towards a better functioning of democracy. How do you make democracy more receptive and beneficial for the very people to whom it is meant to serve? Let's look at the concept of democracy first, in terms of what it essentially means. And when we talk about the concept of democracy, the essence of democracy is rule of the people. So, obviously, when we are talking about democracy, we are talking about a political system in which people decide the kind of government to whom they entrust the responsibility of managing the affairs which directly or indirectly affect their lives. So, in that sense, democracy as a form of government reflects the choice of people in the ruling institutions, which go on to decide the policies and their implementation. At a more popular level, as it has been famously said, that when we talk about democracy, it's people who decide their own government. Therefore, democracy essentially means rule of the people, for the people, and by the people. What do we mean when we say democracy is rule of the people? It essentially means that it's the people themselves who are part and parcel of the micro and the macro functioning of the affairs of the nation, the will of the people, their desires, their expectations are to be part and parcel of the decision making structures. When we say democracy is a form of government which is for the people, it essentially makes it important for a democracy to make these policies and regulations sensitive to the popular aspirations. Therefore, democratic decisions, when they are arrived at, are decisions that reflect what people want. And when we see democracy as being a political system which is by the people, the policy planning and execution is done by a set of individuals and the institutions therein, which are effectively created by the will of the people themselves. So, in that sense, whether we talk about the operational aspects of democracy or we talk about the conceptual aspects of democracy, people are the essence. And therefore, we would not be wrong if we say we, the people, are the essence of democracy. It's no wonder, therefore, that the preamble of the Constitution of India starts with we, the people. So, the people of the country are the sovereign, who ultimately are at the fulcrum of all the decision making processes. While this is what the larger concept of democracy is all about, in its more practical manifestations, democracy is supposed to mean popular participation, rule of law, human rights, and a commitment to equality. What is popular participation? When we talk about popular participation, democracy is a form of political system where people at both the micro level and at the macro level take part not just in the selection of the governments, selection of the representatives, which is in a way a manifestation of the electoral democracy. But even once a government is elected to power, the manner in which it takes decisions are subject to public discourse and public debate. If there is no popular participation in a political system which calls itself democratic, there would be a fundamental contradiction because then decisions would be reflective more of what the ruling class wants those decisions to be. So there has to be a connect between the people and the decisions in terms of popular participation. Rule of law is, you can say, the fulcrum, the steel frame around which any democratic functioning is to be established. The Constitution, which epitomizes the rule of law in the country, lays down the guiding principles, the frameworks which are supposed to guide the laws of the land. The laws, in that sense, set the benchmarks around which the state and the society are supposed to function. And therefore, it is of utmost importance that the institutions which are there in the democracy are in accordance with the principles and the practice of law. Human rights effectively is the fundamental dictum of any democracy. These are those rights which are applicable to all human beings. They are intrinsic to human existence, and therefore they are of universal nature. True democracy is that democracy which has a deep commitment to human rights, and therefore these rights are universal across caste, class, religion, gender, language, or any other social criteria. A vibrant democracy is that democracy which underpins a fundamental commitment to human rights for all its citizens, irrespective of where they may come from. And emerging from this commitment to human rights is the fundamental commitment to equality of all its citizens. Since individuals, people, as part of the larger society and citizenry are important, there has to be a commitment of political, economic, and social equality to all individuals to make the democracy very vibrant. And this particular model of popular participation, rule of law, human rights, and commitment to equality should manifest itself in our local domain, national domain, as well as the global domain. So, when we talk about local democracy, it essentially means that when we talk about our grassroots level representation in terms of panchayats, the urban rural bodies, where people have a direct connect with the representatives that they have, and they are able to connect with the issues which are immediately local to them. There should be a general accomplishment of all these ideals of popular participation, human rights, etc. When we talk about national level, in terms of national symbols, in terms of national commitment, in terms of the diversity that exists within the nation, again, all these fundamental principles of equality, rule of law, institutions become important. And the same principle, in a way, applies also at the global level. Even though we do not really have a global equivalent of a global government, yet democracy taken in its global manifestation reflects an international system where there is equality among nations, there is freedom of movement, and there is a commitment to human rights and democracy across. With this as the backdrop of the concept of democracy, how exactly does democracy manifest itself across various spectrums? And it's easy for us to categorize this democratic manifestation at three broad levels. And these three levels are not distinct or disconnected, but they are interrelated to each other. At one level, one form of democracy we often talk about is political democracy. And there are various ways in which one can talk about the manifestation of political democracy. There is this very, very important and significant electoral dimension of political democracy. A democracy would be sound in its political manifestation if it has a robust electoral system, which enables a very smooth transition of power from one democratically elected government to another. If a country has well established electoral norms, electoral institutions, a very well developed political culture, which has seen transition of governments from one stage to another using very well defined and accepted electoral practices, it indeed becomes the first marker of a very, very healthy democracy. But then, electoral democracy is only one dimension, though a very important dimension of political democracy. Commitment to constitutionalism is the other most important political dimension of democracy as we talk about it. Electoral democracy plays a certain role in putting the elected representatives in place. Once the government is elected, it becomes the responsibility of the institutions which are created to safeguard democracy to play a very significant role in safeguarding the political processes in the country. We have seen so many examples the world over where even elected representatives at times have the tendency of not sticking to the fundamental constitutional principles as they are laid down. And it is exactly there the various institutions, such as the legislature and the judiciary, and the various bodies that are created to safeguard such institutions, should play their active role. Therefore, electoral democracy and constitutional democracy both are very, very integral part of the larger political democracy that we essentially talk of. Then there is this dimension of social democracy. We talk about democracies existing in societies which are quite diverse at times. There are homogeneous societies, there are diverse societies. Democracy becomes a political system which presents a way of managing these social diversities in a harmonious, in a collective kind of a manner. So, the social dimensions of democracy, therefore, motivate us to create an atmosphere so that there is greater social harmony existing. At the same time, social democracy stands for egalitarianism, where principles of equality, not influenced by the caste, cultural, or ethnic background, should matter. A third very important of democracy is the economic dimension of democracy. When we talk about the economic dimension of democracy or the economic democracy, we talk about equality of opportunity and benefit that should accrue to all the citizens of the country. Economic democracy, therefore, underpins a growth model for a country where economic growth coincides not just with aggregate growth of national income, but it also entails economic growth in terms of inclusion of the larger sections of society in the process of that economic development. In such a system, disparities may exist, but these disparities would not be of a nature which, in that sense, creates a deep economic divide within the country. Economic democracy also, therefore, is a manifestation of inclusive development. When we talk about development, the whole idea of development which includes all groups, all communities in terms of their economic welfare becomes a paramount principle. Therefore, economic democracy is synonymous with inclusive development, and that should be the fundamental goal of any democracy that also seeks economic democracy as part and parcel of its larger principles. Now, all these three dimensions are not distinct, they are not disparate. In fact, they are interlinked with each other, and they are very vital for the more comprehensive overall framework of democracy to flourish. If any of these components of democracy or forms of democracy lags behind the holistic development of the democracy in a particular country, may eventually suffer. So, from that perspective, for a country's democracy to be truly effective and efficient, its political democracy, social democracy, and economic democracy all should function simultaneously together so that it becomes an inclusive democracy in the real sense of the term. When we look at India as a democracy, we are proud of our own evolution as a democracy over the years. In our neighborhood and in the world, India stands apart as a model of democracy which perhaps offers solutions to a large number of problems that many other countries face as part and parcel of their own democratic experimentation. And when we talk about India's own evolution as a democracy, there are a variety of historical, cultural, and political constructs which make India a unique democracy. First and the foremost, we always try to look the concept of democracy in India not as a modern concept, which was introduced in the late 20th century, but for us, democracy as a concept has had deep historical, civilizational, and cultural construct. The reason why we say democracy has a civilizational connect as far as India is concerned is because both in the kind of village systems that operated in India since the ancient period and the empires that got created in India at several points of time, the connect between the people, the system of the government that existed, the decision making, there have been enough examples in our deep historical tradition when there had been a synergy between all these three. And in some form or the other, these synergies survived years of external invasion, no matter how alien political systems were brought in, somewhere down the line, the connect between people and the way society was organized around them remained very, very important. The other most important fulcrum or the marker of democracy in India emerged in context of our own freedom movement, which in that sense truly was a people's movement. The freedom movement in India represented a desire of millions of Indians to become free from the shackles of the colonial rule through a certain belief in the values and premises that were put forward by our freedom fighters. So, freedom movement and its ideals, particularly those premised on nonviolence, tolerance, equality of opportunity among all communities, in that sense, linked up with the civilizational connect that was there as far as India's own evolution was concerned. Post independence, when we talk about India's own evolution as a democracy, the Indian constitution emerged as the fundamental symbol around which most of our democratic transition took place. Our constitution, its major components like fundamental rights, directive principles, a series of legislations that were drawn up over a certain period of time, talking about the rights of the most marginal groups within the country, and the system of laws that was sought to be created to govern the new nation, all reflected certain virtues of constitutionalism. And this constitutionalism in India was expected to be the benchmark for all of its citizens, irrespective of which caste, color, religion, creed that they came from. So, constitutionalism and secularism, therefore, became important virtues which guided India's democracy in the post independence period. Another factor that has kept Indian democracy together is that diversity has been the biggest strength of India as a nation. The rest of the world marvels at how India has managed to cope up with this diversity and at the same time maintain our democratic credentials. Whereas other countries have fallen prey to various sectarian and divisive tendencies which have affected their democratic evolution, India continues to be an inspiring example in which we have been able to manage the diversities that exist. And finally, in a diverse democracy like ours, dialogue always remains a very, very important component, which in a way influences or shapes the model of democracy that we seek to achieve. Healthy democracies are characterized by a healthy dialogue that takes place between its citizens, between the citizens and the state, between the state and the civil society. And in that sense, Indian democracy has prospered fairly well in the recent years. How do we look at, therefore, the idea of democracy moving forward? And in that sense, how do we evolve towards making democracy a much better democracy than what it actually is? I think for a country like India, which is always in a stage of incremental transition, we have to have a model of democracies where the ideas of India continuously have to evolve and emerge. A country like India cannot have a single idea of India which can become all pervasive. So therefore, a comprehensive idea of India which includes diversity, plurality, distinctiveness of thoughts has to be encouraged. The role of institutions will remain very, very important when we talk about democracies like ours. As I said earlier, there have been examples in the past when elected representatives or democratically elected groups may often go on a path which comes in conflict with some of the most fundamentally accepted constitutional principles. So, when we have a situation like that, the institutions of the democracy have to come to the rescue of correcting the aberrations that emerge when the nature of your electoral democracy goes wrong. So, institutions are going to be very, very important conscience keepers of democracy. Youth are going to be very, very important fulcrum of the manner and the direction in which our democracy shall evolve. Because the youth taken together bring a new consciousness altogether. They are the biggest stakeholders in our democratic experimentations. And as we will see in the lectures that follow, there is a greater emphasis on youth when we talk about our various electoral management exercises. The youth are the biggest stakeholders, therefore, in the democratic process. They are the ones who will be directly affected by the kind of democracy we have in future. And finally, the biggest challenge before our democracy, and in that sense, the quality of democracy in future will be determined by the way we are able to manage the dissent and the debates that emerge out of diverse democracies like ours, and how we are able to maintain a balance between them. So, these, in my view, are some of the fundamental concepts which are important to understand and analyze democracy in general, and in particular, an evolving democracy like India. Thank you.